allied countries as well, theoretically the United States. Do you have a response to that?
Well, what I'd say, number one, is it's just reckless and irresponsible for the leader of a major nuclear-armed power to be saber-rattling the way that he is with respect to potential use for nuclear weapons. Obviously, we monitor this and have continued to monitor this very closely. I can tell you we've seen nothing, even despite the reckless rhetoric, that would cause us to change our strategic deterrent posture. And look, lastly, if Mr. Putin and Russian officials are worried about their troops in Ukraine getting hit with weapons from other countries, then the easiest thing to do is just take your troops and leave.
That is really absurd. Take your troops and leave. What planet is he on?
It is reckless and irresponsible for the President of the United States, the leader of NATO, to treat Russian national security interests with complete contempt and disinterest. That's number one. And we've been doing that, I would argue, for at least 20 years. Number two, his troops aren't going anywhere, but ours might. And I think that's what no one in Washington wants to admit. We're very close to the potential for people in Europe to say, look, we've had it with this. We didn't sign on for a war with Russia. Your recklessness could lead to just such an outcome. So we think you probably ought to get out of here. Now, I think that could happen in Poland, even though the Poles have been very, very solicitous to us. I think they've begun to think carefully about where they stand on the front lines. I know the Germans are wondering about the wisdom of having them. I know the Finns are reconsidering. I think the Swedish electorate is beginning to have concerns about our readiness to put nuclear weapons on Swedish and Finnish soil. An act that, in my judgment, is complete insanity. But this is the sort of stupidity we've engaged in. So, I think NATO is falling apart internally, behind the scenes. It's very fractious, but we don't see that. Everyone is maintaining the facade, but the facade's going to crumble.
Will NATO give up on its goal of Ukrainian membership?
Oh, of course. But NATO itself will go away. That's the problem. Since they decided to make this fight in eastern Ukraine as an existential question for NATO, not for the United States, but for NATO, and the Russians viewed this from the very beginning as an existential matter for them, since eastern Ukraine sits right on their borders. And they were very concerned about the stupidity that we are now pursuing in Scandinavia, put a nuclear weapon right on Russia's borders within easy range of Russian cities and the Russian nuclear deterrent. So from their standpoint, they've acted as one would have expected and as many people predicted, including George Kennan and others, and Ambassador Burns, who said that if you persist in this, you'll end up at war with Russia. We, on the other hand, turned this thing into an existential question for NATO. Either we win in Ukraine, this was the argument, or we're finished. Well, guess what? You're going to get what you wanted. You're finished. NATO may not be dead yet, but it's certainly on life support.
I just want to go back to Israel for a minute. I promised I would run this, and I forgot, and we moved on to Russia. This is a montage of American members of Congress, including Senator Graham, unfortunately, expressing their opinions on President Biden's holdup on the 2,000-pound and 2,500-pound bombs going to Israel. Again, this is produced by Politico, cut number 2.
This idea of withholding weapons to Israel as a condition of somehow, Joe Biden wanted to micromanage their war effort over there, their defensive effort, is catastrophic policy.
In my view, Netanyahu should not have gotten a nickel so long as he continued this incredibly destructive war. I'm glad to see that the president is beginning to move in that direction.
Withholding weapons makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to get American hostages back and Israeli hostages back because you're incentivizing bad behavior.
I don't agree with the president. It demonstrates to Hamas that they're winning the PR war.
You can't go after 10, 20, or a brigade of Hamas and kill thousands of innocent people. There's got to be a better way of doing it. And I think that's simply what the President of the United States is saying.
They're more concerned about their pro-Hamas wing of the Democrat Party, which we're seeing is part of the radicalized left.
I think the president has taken exactly the correct action, something that many of us have been calling for weeks. He's made it clear that Netanyahu cannot continue to blatantly defy the United States President, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of State.
I don't know. Do you think the students at Columbia and the University of Michigan or wherever else they may have been, I think they're all gone now because of graduations, had an influence on Joe Biden? Do you think they influenced members of Congress, or these are just two warring camps, lowercase w and warring, in the Congress digging their heels in?
Yes, I think the demonstrators actually had an impact. And I often recall what you and I can remember, at least I know I can. You may not be as old as I am, but I remember what happened during the Vietnam War with great clarity. And at the time, I was a teenager and frankly, somewhat confused because in my own household, people were divided. And my mother kept saying, well, we have to support the war. We have to support the troops. And my grandfather had been in World War I, would say over and over again, if you support the troops, bring them home. So you had two different generations with two different views. So I guess to some extent, you're seeing that here. Now, Bernie Sanders expressed the right sentiment. And I think Bernie knows, if I may use his first name, that this is not about Hamas. That's the thing that everyone is missing. This is a war for Jewish supremacy in the Middle East, period. That's what Mr. Netanyahu wants, and that's what his population wants him to pursue. Now, how do you do that? Well, first of all, you expel the Muslim Arabs on your territory, or Christian Arabs if they happen to be Christians. You just expel them. You push them out once and for all and create a Jewish pure state. And then you turn eventually against Hezbollah. That is the one so-called militia that presents very real danger to Israel. That's what we're about. That's what they're talking about. And that's what the other senators are supporting. Now, why are they doing that? You know, is it because they have this deep abiding love for Israel? I don't think so. I think it has a lot to do with money. And if you go to the various think tanks in Washington, D.C., you just look at who the donors are. Where did all the money come from? Where does all the money come from that persuades senators from states where very few people have any interest whatsoever at what goes on beyond our borders to so vigorously support what the Israelis are doing? Again, it's one thing to say, look, and I believe this, and I've always believed this, Israel can play a very positive role in the world, and I think it has. I think it's an unusual concentration of human capital and talent, and the world, and especially the Middle East, can benefit from it. But that's not what's going on today. What's going on is something very different as we've described it. And I don't think the senators care about any of it. I think they're preeminently concerned about where the money goes. I hate to be blunt about that. I know that's cynical, but that's my view. Whereas I think at least Ro Khanna, although I disagree with him, I think Bernie Sanders is correct. From the very beginning, this should not have been funded. But at least he's come on board and recognizes this should not be funded. But they're almost insignificant compared with the rest of the world. You have over 140 nations that have effectively walked away from Israel and by implication away from us. We in Israel are increasingly isolated in the world, Judge.
Thank you, Colonel. Colonel, you put your finger right on it. You know, you and I have a close mutual friend in the House of Representatives who has received money from AIPAC, but since he voted against the Congress defining anti-Semitism and voted against the additional aid to Israel and Ukraine, he's been stripped from that, along with about 15 or 20 other Republicans, mostly libertarian. He's been stripped from that website.
Now, you know, Judge, there is one other aspect to this thing that has to be mentioned. There are many people in Washington that regard Israel as an extension of our global military hegemony. Now, I regard that as utterly delusional. I'm talking about global military hegemony. Anybody who thinks they can dominate the world in military power or economic power or anything else is delusional. But we have a lot of them inside the Beltway that very much feel that way. You know, historically, and I think this is something that Professor Mearsheimer has pointed out, We have almost from our inception as a country been the dominant power in our own hemisphere. And that was enough. But since the Second World War, we have been striving for this position of global hegemony. And a lot of people think that Israel is at least partially our instrument. I do not, nor do I think anybody beyond the borders of the United States is necessarily our instrument. But that's a popular view.
And unfortunately, many of the people that think that way have the power to take money out of our pockets, called taxes, or borrow money in our name, called inflation, and send it over there.
Absolutely.
Exactly what we have witnessed. Colonel, thank you for your extraordinary analysis of all this. You analyze so clearly both issues as they stand today, as we understand them. See you again next week. All the best to you, my friend.
Okay, same to you, Judge. Glad you're back.